All right, thanks, Maggie. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys about invasive species. Just to give you a little oversight on how this is going to go, I'm going to give some background on what invasive species is and some of the causes and implications of them. And then we'll actually get into, I've collected a bunch of samples, so I'll show you on the screen. And after I do each sample species, I'll ask if anyone has any questions at that time. You can feel free to just unmute yourself if you have a question. So I'll be saying that throughout my presentation. So first, to start off, I thought I'd just define what is an invasive species. So an invasive species is a non-native species whose introduction causes economic, environmental, or social harm. So a species that's just non-native to the area doesn't necessarily make it invasive. It has to cause some sort of harm for it to be considered invasive. So in terms of some of the causes of invasive species, the first I'll talk about is human colonization. So people colonizing a new area, possibly bringing in species to that area that weren't from there before, and then they end up taking over and becoming invasive in that area. So one interesting example is in New York City, there was a time when an individual wanted to bring in all of the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare into the United States. And that actually has caused some of the birds from that are invasive. So that's one cause. Another cause is via things such as agriculture, aquaculture, horticulture. So people bringing in things either for their landscaping or for farming purposes, and then they end up getting out of their garden, out of their pond, their farm, into the native environment. And if it's so most cases would be a plant taking over an area where there were native plants before. Another cause would be biological control. So this is actually a method of controlling invasives if done correctly. So if an invasive species is here, people think, oh, well, what controlled it in its native environment? We'll just bring that and have that take care of the invasive species, which can be good if it's properly studied and we make sure that that thing you're bringing in doesn't become invasive itself. But there have been cases in the past before we fully understood this where people have just brought something else in to control something that was already invasive, and it starts becoming invasive itself. Another cause would be accidental transport. So people just haven't done it on purpose, but it comes into the area. So a few examples of that you might be familiar with pretty recently. Zika virus was a concern down in Florida and the Caribbean. So that's caused by the Asian tiger mosquito, and that's an invasive species. Another, I'm sorry, that's actually not an accidental transport, but what I meant to say was zebra mussels coming in from ballast water. So you may have seen those on the beaches of the Great Lakes. Another form of accidental transport, you've maybe heard of emerald ash borer, and that actually came in on shipping pallets. So that was accidentally brought into the US. The final cause is indirect causes. So when you think of if you were to clear cut an area or farm it, or if it becomes urbanized, you're leaving that area vulnerable to invasion. So you've cleared the natural forest area, and that leaves it open for these invasive species to come in. A lot of times invasive species are invasive because of the fact that they are really good at growing or reproducing rapidly and quicker than those native species, so they can take over. In terms of implications of invasive species, the first would be a loss of biodiversity. So when an invasive species comes in, if it's a plant, it maybe will take over a whole area where other plants can't grow. If it's an animal, it's reproducing more rapidly, eating the food source that these non-natives would eat, or these native species would eat, and therefore they can't compete. So you're just having less species overall, which can impact our ecosystem, so you don't have that good balance. Another implication would be local competition is decreased. So it's good to have competition in the environment, having different species competing with each other to keep each other in check. If you lose that, then when these invasive species come in, that's another implication. The third would be human disease, and I accidentally glanced ahead when I just mentioned the Asian tiger mosquito before. This is where I meant to say it. So an implication of Zika virus from an invasive species. Another implication would be economic impacts. So if you think of certain insect pests that maybe would impact farming crops, or I mentioned the emerald ash borer, affecting timber products, or you can have different species in the water. So different resources that we utilize economically can be impacted. In terms of control of invasive species, as we go through the specific examples I have, I'm going to mention various control methods because it is somewhat specific, although you'll hear some of the same methods being used. But the most important thing is to prevent invasive species from spreading before they become a problem. So early detection, which would be detecting invasive species early on before it's a big widespread problem, is the best way to manage them if possible. So basically nipping it in the bud before it becomes a problem, getting rid of the invasive. However, unfortunately, a lot of the invasives that we're going to talk about today, I picked some of the more common ones. They're already pretty widespread. So although if it comes into a new area, say if it comes into your yard, you can take care of it. When we look at an area where it's already established, we're not able to maybe remove it all. So then our next best bet for control would be to try to stop it from spreading further. If you've gone camping, you maybe have heard the rules of not transporting firewood. So that is because emerald ash borer can be found in firewood. We don't want it to spread further than it already is. We know it's there, but we're trying to stop it from spreading. And then finally, in terms of control, long-term management plans can be important for, when you're looking at invasive species that is really wide already, we maybe don't care so much about a roadside ditch as we do about maybe a park or a preserve. So we maybe create a plan to get rid of the invasives in that area that are more important to us. So that's just a little background on invasive species. So now we're going to get into the good stuff. I've got a bunch of samples here for you guys to see. So our first species is Phragmites, also called common reed. So if you look here, it's a perennial grass, which means it comes back year after year. It was accidentally introduced from Europe, most likely from ballast water material, and it can form really dense clonal stands up to 15 feet tall. So the leaves are a bluish green color. If you look close, these are the leaf blades, so they are pretty much the largest grass blade you'll see in the area. If you see this, it's pretty distinct. If you look, this is a trait of all grasses, but it does have a hollow stem, so that's another thing to look for. And then I have behind me, what I think is the most obvious way to identify them is going to be the flowers. So the flowers form this long panicle, and this is actually last year's flowers, so it hasn't yet flowered yet this year, but they do persist, so I collected these. But they will turn this really beautiful, actually purple to goldish bloom color in this large panicle of flowers. And as I said, they can get up to 15 feet tall. I brought the whole stem just to give you an idea of how tall those can get when I collected that. So Phragmites can be found in wet areas such as wetlands, roadside ditches. They like full sun. And then in terms of treatment, altering water levels can have some success. So flooding an area can impact the Phragmites. However, it isn't usually 100% successful by itself. Usually that can be used in combination with something else. Another treatment method would be to spray the Phragmites with an herbicide like glyphosate, Roundup, and then cutting it. So usually you'd spray it, you'd wait about 2 weeks at least for the plant to take up the herbicide, and then you would cut it. Also, sometimes cutting is early. If it's a huge stand that you really can't get in and spray, you can cut it earlier first before doing the spray, but let it grow up a little bit and spray it and cut it again. So that's our first species. So I'll just, as we're going through, I'll now ask if anyone does have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and let me know. If not, we'll move on to the next species. All right. So our next species that we're going to talk about is Tartarian honeysuckle. So this species was brought over from Asia for ornamental purposes. So you might find this in your garden. It was used as a garden plant, and then also used as, it was actually recommended by the DEC till about the 1980s to be utilized for soil stabilization, wildlife planting, and you might see it like as a hedgerow. So since then, it's obviously not recommended anymore, as we've learned that it is an invasive species. It's escaped its cultivation, so it got out of control, left those gardens or those hedgerows and got into the wild and started competing. So it is a woody shrub, so this is just a cutting of one of the branches, but it does form a shrub. One way that it is a successful invasive species is it leaves out very early in the spring and then persists late into the fall. So when you walk in the woods in the spring and you see green, one of the first things you may see if honeysuckle is around is the honeysuckle. And this gives it a competitive advantage because other plants haven't leafed out yet, so it can take in that sunlight, get that energy before other plants have a chance to. In terms of identifying this plant, I'm gonna hold a branch up here close for you to see. So these are the leaves. They're this ovate shape. They have a point at the end. When we look at leaf structure, so leaves can either be opposite each other on a branch, like this leaf is. They can alternate, so going back and forth, or they can be whirled more than two around. So in this case, if you look, these are opposite each other. So that's something we would look for. One of the things that might stand out for you, and it's a good time to spot this, in developing in May to June, are the flowers. So they are these tubular flowers that develop, and they form red berries, which, as I mentioned, our birds really do enjoy. So honeysuckle can invade open woodlands, old fields, disturbed sites. In terms of control of honeysuckle, cutting the whole shrub at the stump and then painting on an herbicide such as glyphosate is pretty successful. And then also, if you are able to get at it when it's only seedlings, hand removal of the seedlings can be pretty successful. All right, so if you have any questions on honeysuckle, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, our next species that I'm going to talk about is Japanese knotweed. So this one, I did collect these this morning, but it's already shriveling up, but I'll hold out the leaves so you can see it. So Japanese knotweed was introduced as an ornamental and also used for erosion control. It's a perennial shrub, and it can grow from 3 to 15 feet tall. You'll find this on roadsides, in wetlands, in woodland edges, and on riverbanks. So I'm from the Buffalo area, so a lot of times if I go canoeing down any of our local rivers, you'll see just the whole riverbank overtaken by Japanese knotweed, and you can't even see over it because it's so tall. So I've collected a few of the stems, which if you look at those, they kind of look like bamboo. However, they look woody, but they truly are a herbaceous plant. But if you look at the end, it is hollow, so that's something to look for. These stalks do persist through the winter. So I actually found, this is one of the stalks that was from last year that I collected. So it, it takes on this brown color, but it will persist late into the winter and even spring. So looking at the leaves of this plant, they're ovate and very broad, so they're pretty large leaf. If you look at the shape of it, it can be what we call deltoid, which is kind of a triangular shape, or cordate, which is a heart shape. So kind of looks like a heart. So that's a good way to identify. The leaves are very obvious along with that bamboo structure. Later in the season, so August to September, they will develop these greenish white flower sprays that will then turn into these small winged fruits. So they form pretty dense thickets. There's little growth under, so this can actually be a concern, particularly along riparian areas like riverbanks, where erosion can occur. So there's nothing growing under it. In my opinion, Japanese knotweed is one of the worst invasives I've encountered, just because it can literally grow through anything, including concrete. So in the UK, where they've had Japanese knotweed a little longer than we have as an invasive problem, a lot of their house foundations are actually being destroyed by Japanese knotweed growing through it, which is crazy. And so they're losing the property value of their homes because of Japanese knotweed. So it's definitely one, if you see near your home, you do not want to, you want to get rid of it. In terms of control, though, it is extremely hard to control. In terms of how you can do it, though, mechanical removal is an option, although you really need to dig down deep, and it's hard work. I've done it a few times, and you need to get the whole root. And as I mentioned, it's pretty long, so it's something you probably are going to have to do over multiple seasons. It is really important when you do dispose of Japanese knotweed that you don't, just throw it to the side. You need to double bag it in like black contractor bags for disposal, because any little piece of the plant can root. So just a small piece of the stem, if that gets out, that can reroot. So it's important to never, mow or cut into small pieces when you're trying to get rid of this plant. That won't do anything. You'll actually just spread it more. Chemical control is an option. And sometimes what some of the control methods I've done is to actually dig it up and remove it, and then put down geotextile fabric, like that landscaping fabric, and then put wood chips over it, and to cover that area. But you still need to be vigilant. As I mentioned, knotweed can grow through concrete, so it can still grow through that, that fabric. So if you see it coming up, you gotta get rid of it. So this is definitely a hard one to control, but it's a good one to be aware of, especially if you do end up finding it on your own property. So feel free, if you have any questions, unmute yourself.
Angie?
Yes?
Hi. Getting back to the honeysuckle, what is it that you said we should put after we cut the stem down? It's a herbicide?
Yeah, so like glyphosate, Roundup, rodeo, those common names. You can use like a paintbrush and spread it right onto the stump. That's like your best method. Some of these like more woody shrub species, if you don't do that, if you just cut it at the stump, it'll actually sprout again from the stump. So that just prevents that.
They're all over my property. I ordered from DEC years ago.
Oh, back in the day, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Okay, thanks.
All right, one moment here. This next one I'm pulling up is thorny, so I just gotta get it out here. All right. The next species we're going to talk about is Multiflora Rose. So here it is here. This species was brought over from Asia as an ornamental for erosion control and a living fence. So similar to honeysuckle we were just talking about, it used to be recommended for those purposes. So it is a shrub, and it'll form, this is just a cutting, and it'll form this long arcing canes. So these will tip over, and they actually the tip will touch the ground and reroot, and it can spread that way. One of the distinguishing features that I'm trying to avoid right now is it has these recurved thorns. So if you think of a cat claw, got that up close there, those are on there. And so if you are walking through the woods and you happen to come across a multiflora patch, that you will definitely know because you'll get caught in it. In terms of leaf structure, so not getting too in depth with botany, but this whole structure here is considered one leaf. So all of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, these are all leaflets that make up one leaf. And when you look at how they're arranged, each one except for the one at the tip are opposite each other, and that's called a pinnate arrangement. So that is the leaf structure, and each leaflet has jagged edge, so a toothed margin, we would call it, along the edge. They also, later in the season, they will form clusters of white flowers. These don't always show up if Multiflora Rose is in a shaded area, but it does love full sun, so if it's in the sun, you'll see those flowers. And then they will turn into red fruits later in the summer. They form really dense thickets. They can invade woodlands, forest edges, and as I mentioned, they really like full sun areas, but not necessarily the only place you'll find them. In terms of control, there's some success with using herbicides. Using them later in the season is more successful. And then also mechanical removal. You do need to make sure if you're digging this out that you get all the roots. So just pulling it's not going to work. If you have any questions on Multiflora Rose, just let me know.
Yeah, I have a question on the Multiflora Rose.
Sure.
Just hacking it off and letting it drop, is that any way of controlling it?
Unfortunately, it's just going to keep sprouting that way. I would recommend, really getting it all the way to the base. You can hack away to get access there, definitely, because you're going to be overtaken by thorns. But you definitely want to get to the base, or try just spraying it, broadcast spraying it with an herbicide.
Okay, so you can hack it, but then you need to access where the roots are and
yeah,
and
definitely cut stuff back first so you're not getting torn up by the thorns. But yeah, then after that you'll want to actually get to the base.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. All right, so our next species is common buckthorn. Here's just a cutting here. This species was brought over from Europe as ornamental, as a hedgerow and a windbreak. There's actually 2 species of buckthorn that are both invasive in our area, common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a glossy buckthorn sample today, but I will mention some of the differences. It has some similarity in how it looks, but I just wanted to bring that up. So this is a shrub to a small tree. It can grow up to about 22 feet. This species, if you're looking, I'm gonna bring one of the leaves up close. It's rounded, it's pointed at the tip. And one of the distinct ways to identify it, so within the leaf, if you see these veins that are coming off of that center line, they come out, they curl, and they all point towards the tip. So that's called arcuate venation, and that's a way of identifying the species. It's also jagged around the edge. Now I mentioned glossy buckthorn. That one, actually, the veins come out and they form kind of a V pattern going up. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those to show you. But later in the season, this will be easier to spot. Once it has its flowers, it forms these greenish white clusters right at the base of the leaf. And there's 4 petals on the flower. And then the berries that it forms are this dark purple to almost black color. So if you see those berries, that's that's a giveaway. So a lot of berries, you know, we don't really see that color as much. So that could be a way to identify it. It prefers lightly shaded conditions. Can be found in wooded edges, openings in woodlands and prairies and open fields. So similar to the honeysuckle that we talked about, an effective method of control is to cut it at the stump and then paint on that herbicide. And it's really important to do that. If you just cut it, it's going to re-sprout, and you'll see just a bunch of new plants starting. If you do catch it at the seedling stage, hand pulling them can be very effective. And then there have been, obviously you wouldn't be doing this in your backyard, but in like some parks and preserves, they have done prescribed burning for seedlings when it's kind of overtaken a whole area. So that is a common buckthorn. Feel free if you have any questions. I'm just going to grab our next species. All right, so the next species that we're going to talk about is garlic mustard. So this species is a herbaceous plant that is found in disturbed woodlots or forest edges. It came over from both Europe and Asia, and it was introduced for both medicinal uses, so it can be utilized as an antiseptic or an anti-asthmatic, and also it's used as a food, so it is edible. So this plant is interesting in that there's a 2-year life cycle. So what I'm holding is actually the 2nd year. That's probably what you'll notice, but I have here also a cluster of what's our 1st year growth. So I'll hold these leaves up close. So these are found this is actually the full cluster. So it's right at the base of the ground. So it's really not going to be what stands out to you, but they have these kidney-shaped leaves with a scalloped margin. So that's going to be the 1st year growth. The 2nd year growth is, as I said, what's more obvious. So this is the stalk that will form. Unfortunately, it's right at the end of the season for flowering. I did collect a flower, but it may have already fallen off on me. Let's see. All right. Well, there's a very tiny one here. As I said, it's really near the end of the season, but they're these small little white flowers. They have 4 white petals, so sorry, you won't be able to see that too well. But after the flowers do fall off, you'll see the seed pods, which are these right here. They're 4-sided, and they have little black seeds lined up in a row like a pea pod. In terms of identifying based on the leaves as well, they're these triangular type leaves that are sharp teeth along the edges, and as they move up the plant, they get smaller. So really those pods though do stand out later in the season. An interesting fact about this plant that helps it to be an invasive is it has what we call allelopathic, and that means that it produces chemicals in the ground that actually prevent other plants from growing near it. So that definitely gives an advantage. So it also does form dense stands in general and outcompetes other plants. In terms of control, hand pulling can be pretty successful. It's important to do it earlier in the season. So now, it's gone to seed and that's going to drop soon. So you want to try to do it before the seeds form and basically, fall and keep growing again. However, with hand pulling, you will have to repeat it probably up to about 5 years if it's been there for a little bit, just because there is a bit of a seed bank that is formed, and also because it has that 2-year life cycle. So it's likely that the 2nd year is going to sprout up. In terms of another way to control it would be just using a chemical spray. Doing that in like March to April is a good timing for that when it's one of the few plants that's growing, so you won't be hitting other species around it. So that's garlic mustard. All right, so the last one I'm going to talk about, unfortunately, we're not in the woods, but I did want to touch on emerald ash borer. I know this has been pretty plant heavy. I am a botanist, so, but I wanted to touch on emerald ash borer, as a lot of you have probably encountered it or heard of it at least. So emerald ash borer is a wood boring beetle. It's native to Asia, and it was brought over, I mentioned earlier, in shipping pallets, so accidentally. And it will feed on and solely feed on ash trees and kill them. So that's why it's no problem, because that's the only thing it feeds on. So I do just have a few pictures I'm going to hold up to the screen just so you can get a glimpse here. So the first one is the adult. It's this metallic green color. If you see, there's a picture on there of the penny, so it is smaller than a penny. That's just for scale. The adult will lay its eggs in a bark crevice, and then the larva will hatch. So here I have a picture of the larva. They're white, and they will feed in the wood underneath the bark for 1 to 2 years, and then they will emerge as an adult and then go on to the next tree, where then that cycle will continue. In terms of identifying if a tree is infected, I have a few different things you can look for. The first would be this picture here. The finger is pointing at these D-shaped exit holes. So a lot of insects that bore form like a round hole. So if you look and see something that's more shaped like a D, that's something to look for. Another thing that will clue you in is this canopy dieback from the top down. So if you see an ash tree that the top leaves are missing, but you know, the bottom are still there, you know, that could be it's impacted by emerald ash borer, and it could, in the end, they will all be gone. But that's, you know, earlier on, that can be a clue. Another thing to look for would be this bark splitting. This picture right here, you can see the bark splitting down the tree. Also, if you pull away the bark, you will see these S-shaped cavities where the larvae have eaten through the tree. So right under the bark, you'll see that. And then finally, this middle picture here with the bark stripping, it's called blonding. So that's actually caused from a woodpecker. So they will, you know, they sense that the insects are in the tree in a large supply, and they're stripping away the bark. And that's a really obvious trait you can see in the winter when there's no leaves. If you look up and you see that white stripping on a tree, it's probably emerald ash borer. So unfortunately, when a tree is infected, it usually dies within 2 to 4 years of infestation. There is a way that you can treat a tree, but it is costly and it's not a guarantee. So it's a chemical injection. There's a few different chemicals that have been used somewhat successfully, but it's only effective on a tree that's not showing any symptoms. So if your tree already has emerald ash borer, it's unfortunately, this won't be effective. And you must, if you use this chemical, you have to treat it every 2 years. And as I said, it's costly. So it's really only makes sense if you have, you know, a few important trees that you're trying to save. However, it's not really, you know, it's not feasible for a whole forested area. So really, if your tree has been infected, the best thing to do is to take it down and chip it up. So chipping it up so that we're preventing the emerald ash borer from dispersing further. And then I mentioned earlier in my presentation, you know, not moving firewood so New York has a quarantine zone of 50 miles. So you're not supposed to transport firewood further than that. The thought is that emerald ash borer might be in the wood, and we don't want it to move, you know, out of the range it was already collected. So, you know, with that, that's the last species I had to talk about. So if you have any questions about emerald ash borer or, you know, anything else, feel free to ask me now. If not, you know, thank you so much for your time.
Is Phragmites also a foxtail grass? Or is that a common name for something else?
That's not the name for Phragmites. No, it's the other.
Okay.
I guess the common name is just common reed. but most people, Phragmites is actually the scientific name, Phragmites australis, but it's just what people use to refer to it as.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Excuse me, but what should we do if we see an emerald ash borer?
So I mean, if you see one, it's definitely good to take note of. And if you have any ash trees in the area, you know, it's good to check for those different traits that I mentioned. Unfortunately, we do know it's in the area, so there's not like an active, you know, report line or anything, because we do know it's here. One interesting thing to note, though, some of you may have seen those like purple boxes that were put up around to catch the emerald ash borer, and that was actually, they're not traps to try to prevent them, but it's actually meant to know where it is located. But yeah, unfortunately, we can't you know, we can't do anything if we see it necessarily, except for, you know, don't transport firewood and just try to you know, not let it spread further.
Hi, Angie. How
Hello,
persistent?
I had a question about an invasive orchid that my sister battles with in Michigan. And the characteristics of it are that it must spread by stolons or something. And when you dig it, it often has a very long connection to the next plant. And if you leave any pieces in the ground, pretty much you're gonna get regeneration of new plants. So I was just wondering, maybe, I don't know if you're familiar with the plant, or maybe just based on the characteristics, what the right control method might be.
I'm not specifically familiar with the orchid you're referring to, but as with a lot of these species, you know, I mentioned a few that, you know, mechanical removal as a method. Unfortunately, it is hard, you know, if you don't get all the roots in the first year, you know, it's probably going to come back, but a lot of times kind of keeping at it and just doing it year after year, you will notice there is, you know, a decrease. I can't say for certain about the orchid, but for a lot of these species we talked about today, that is the case, where it's going to take more than one removal if it's in a large area in order to get it all.
Yeah, that's what she's been doing, but it doesn't seem to be effective. So, okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the input.
Question, Angie?
Uh-huh.
The red burning bush I have, it's established along the house and I'm going to leave it. That's now considered invasive, right?
It is, yes. It was added to our New York State invasive list.
Okay, so when I trim, will that reroot if I leave it laying in the woods?
You know, I'm not particularly sure, but with any invasives, it is probably best, you know, to be safe and just bag it up versus, you know, disposing to prevent the spread. Definitely if it's you know, if it's flowering or fruiting, it can spread that way. So I would recommend, you know, for any invasive that you're removing, to not like throw it in, you know, in the woods or your compost pile, just to try to prevent it from spreading further.
Okay, thank you.
Angie, we do have one question from the chat. Ron says, should we attempt to remove honeysuckle growing in a field behind our property?
I mean, I guess, as I mentioned before, you know, you got to prioritize what's important. If it's definitely better to remove it if you have the means of doing it and you can, you know, cut it, and then you know, that cutting and spreading with an herbicide, that's a good way to treat it. It's definitely better to remove it than not. But unfortunately, in terms of if you're looking to like organizations to remove it for you, it may not be the priority. But certainly if it's on your property and you have the ability to, I would definitely recommend it.
Anyone else out there have any questions for Angie? Oh, we have someone. Gary asks, or Jerry, sorry if I butchered that. How persistent is glyphosate in the environment, and how does it contaminate waterways? Is that a concern?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you know, if we are treating an invasive, like in a park area, we would have a licensed, you know, sprayer doing that. It's important. Glyphosate is not, you know, very toxic in the water, but it's not something you want to be dumping into itself. That's why I mentioned, you know, a lot of these plants spreading it right onto the stump is the way to go. So trying to keep it directly at the species you're attempting to control is always important. And make sure, you know, to be using the label device, the label description on how much you want to utilize.
We'll take one more question. Paul asks, are there any native honeysuckles in New York, such as the coral honeysuckle?
I know there are definitely some honeysuckles that are ornamental that are not invasive. I honestly can't say for sure if they are truly native, but I know I've seen, you know, people in gardens have that kind of pinky orange one, which I think is the coral one. I know that's not invasive. I'm not actually sure though if it is native to this area.
All right, if no one else has any questions, Angie, thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and thank you everyone for listening in. I do just want to quickly mention, Angie, you had said that prescribed burning is a method used for some invasives, and we have another presenter actually speaking about land stewardship and prescribed burning tomorrow. So if anyone is interested and hasn't registered yet, you can visit us at Allegany Nature Pilgrimage /virtual ANP to go ahead and register for that. And I'm sure it will be interesting as well. It was great seeing everyone. Thank you again, Angie, and hopefully we'll see everyone next year at Allegany 2021.
Thank you all so much.